Hello everybody, welcome back to Web Dev Simplified. In today's video, we're going to take a look at creating a quiz application in JavaScript so that we can finally figure out who the best YouTuber actually is. Also, if it's your first time on the channel, make sure you subscribe for more videos where I simplify the web for you. Let's get started. To get started, let's look at what we're going to be creating in this video. We have a start button, and when we click this, it's going to initiate the quiz where we have multiple options, and if we click the correct option, you see our screen is going to turn green, and we're going to get the next option, and if we some reason click the wrong option, you see everything is going to turn red, but we still get the next option to go on to the next question. Now before I can answer this question that I know you're all dying to know the answer to, let's start by creating our index.html file, which is where we're going to put all the HTML for our application. If we hit exclamation point and hit enter, it's going to generate the boilerplate documentation for us, and in here we can just put the title as quiz app. Now inside of the body, we're going to have essentially two main sections of our application. We're going to have this card, which is going to have everything inside of it, and then inside of that card we're going to have question content, and then we're going to have content for the start button as well as the next button. So first let's actually create this container, which is going to be our card-like syntax. We can just use a div for that, and we'll give it a class here of container so that we can style this in our CSS later. Next, we're going to put in our question container because our questions are going to come before our next and start button. So we'll just create a div here, which is going to have an ID, which is going to say question container. This is so we can select it in the JavaScript later. And we're also going to add a class of hide so that we know that this is hidden by default. Now before we add all of our question information, let's jump down to our next section, which is going to be our controls section. So let's give it a class of controls so we can style it later in our CSS. And in here, we need two different buttons. We need first a button which is going to contain our start, so we can just say start here, and we're also going to need a second button which is going to say next. Now these buttons are both going to need an ID, so we're going to need a ID here which is going to say start button, and we're also going to want to supply classes to these, so we can just say start button as well as button. Now we can just copy this over to our next button because it's going to be almost exactly the same, but it's going to be a next button ID and class, and we're also going to hide this by default, so we're going to use the hide class as well. Now we can jump into here, our question container, and the first thing we need is a div which is going to contain our question. So we should give it an ID of question for selecting in our JavaScript, and we'll default the text to question so we can see what we're working with. Now we're going to need another div. This one is going to be for our different answer buttons. So we're going to give these an ID here of answer buttons. This is again so we can select it in the JavaScript, and we're also going to give it a class of button grid so we can style it with CSS. Now let's create our buttons in here. These are just going to say simple buttons with a class of button, and then we're just going to use generic answer one text in here for the first one, and we're going to create 4 buttons so we can see what we're working with when we render this. Now let's actually open this with live server and see what we're working with, and as you can see we have our question text, our 4 buttons, as well as our start and next button. Now we can work on adding our different styles and our different JavaScript, so let's create a styles.css as well as a script.js, which is going to contain all of our JavaScript and CSS, and let's make sure we include these. So we're going to add a link tag which is going to have an href to our styles.css, as well as it's going to say that it is a style sheet. Whoops, style sheet, just like that. And we're also going to do the same thing for our script tag. Make sure we defer it so it loads after the body, and we're going to give it a source here, which is going to be script.js. Make sure we close that off. And now we have our style sheet as well as our script tag being loaded into our HTML, and let's work on styling our elements first. Now the first thing that we're going to do is something I do in every single project, and it's going to be setting up our box sizing to be border box for all of our different elements. So let's make sure we select all of our elements, our before and our after, just like this. And inside of here, we want to set box sizing to be border box. This will make it so our widths and heights are easier to style. Also, I'm just going to set the font family here to Gotham Rounded, which is a font that you may not have on your computer, so you can choose whatever font that you like best. Now, after that's done, as you can see, our font has been applied. We can move on to styling our actual body, because as we remember from our previous example here, our body changes color as we select different answers. So let's come back here, select our body, and what we want to do is we want to first remove the padding and margin. So we're just going to set the padding and margin to 0, save that, and you see everything squishes up to the side of the page, which is what we want. We also want to make sure that our quiz is dead center on our screen, as you can see here. So we're going to use display flex to make that possible. We're going to use justify content center and align items center in order to push everything to the center of the screen. And we also need to make sure that our height is set to 100% as well as our width. So let's come in here with our width. We're going to set this equal to 100 view width, which essentially means it's going to take up the entire width. And we're going to do the same thing for the height, but with 100 view height. Now if we save that, you see our content is dead center on our screen. Now to set our colors, we're actually going to use CSS Variables to make this easy. So let's come up here. We're going to set a variable, which is going to be called hue. We can come in here, define it like this, and we want to set this equal to variable dash dash hue neutral, because this is just going to be our default neutral color if we don't have anything selected yet as an answer. And let's define that color. We can come into our root here, and we can define hue neutral, just like this. And we want to make this a hue of 200. And we're going to be using HSL for all of our colors, so we can use our hue of 200 here. And we're also going to, while we're at it, set up our hue for the wrong value, so hue wrong. And this is going to be our deep red color, which in our case, this is just going to be 0. Make sure this is a semicolon here. And also, we can do our hue for correct, which is going to be that nice green color. And this is just going to be a hue of 145. And now down here, what we can do is we can take our background color, background color, and we want to set that to HSL. And the first thing we need to do is get the variable of our hue, which by default is just our hue neutral. So we get our hue. We want to set it to 100% for the saturation and 20% for the lightness because we want this to be a fairly dark color. Now if we save that, you see we get that nice blue color. And in order to change our hue between the wrong and correct version, we're going to be using classes. So we can just say body.correct, which is going to be for when our hue needs to be the correct hue. And all we do is we just need to set this variable for hue to hue correct. Now, if we save this, go into our index here and add a class to body of correct, just like this. Correct. Now if we save that, you see we get the green color as our background. And one last thing we need to do is just set up the wrong value as well. So come in here for a class of wrong, and we have our hue of wrong down here, and we can change our class to wrong, and you can see it changes it that deep red color for us. Let's remove this class because by default we want to use this neutral blue color when we start our quiz. The next thing we want to work on is the container that wraps all of our content. We want to give it this nice card effect. So in order to do that, let's select our container here. And let's go back so we can see as we're doing it. And first thing we want to do is we want to set the width to be 800 pixels. This is essentially the maximum that our width is going to be. And we also want to set a max width, which is going to be 80%. And this way our content doesn't overflow our page. And if we save that, you see it is shrunken down to be essentially 80% of our page width. The next thing we want to do is we want to apply here a background color because we want this to be a white background. And we also want to apply a nice border radius to it. So we can come in here with border radius. And this is just going to be 5 pixels. Now if we save that, you see we get that nice card effect already, but our content's way too close. So let's add a little bit of padding. We'll come in here, let's just say 10 pixels, and you can see that's already looking a lot better, but we don't have the box shadow around it as we do here. So let's add that box shadow. First thing we need to do, type in box shadow here, and the first property is going to be the X offset, which we just want it to be 0. We want it to be the same around the entire thing. Y offset, also 0 for the same reason. Then we're going to come in here, our blur is going to be 10 pixels, because we want it to be a nice faded out box shadow. As you can see here, it really fades out. And next value, the very last one, we want to have 2 pixels, and this is going to be essentially our spread, so how far out from our container it goes. And as you can see, if we save that, we get a very nice dark line around the entire thing due to our spread, and then a nice blurred effect coming out of it because of our blur effect here. Next, we can work on styling our answer grid here. So let's come down, select our button grid, which is the class we applied to that, and we just want to use display grid here to make displaying this easier. And if we save that, you see that they're going to be lined up one on top of each other, but we want actually 2 columns. So we're going to use grid template columns, which is going to define our columns. And we just want to say here, repeat twice because we want 2 columns, and we just want it to be auto width. We want it to be as large as it needs to be. And if we save that, we now get 2 columns right next to each other, but everything's pushed up really close. So let's add a little bit of gap. We're going to use 10 pixels of spacing around everything. And there we go, it spaces out our buttons. But we also want to space out our button grid from our question and our buttons down here. So let's add a little bit of margin. We're going to add 20 pixels on the top and bottom and 0 on the left and right. And now as you can see, it's pushed it away from the top and bottom of our page. Now one of the last things we have to style is the buttons for our page. Let's come down here, we have that generic button class, which is going to be applied to every button on our page. And again, we're going to do the same hue trick that we did with our body. So let's create that hue variable. We're going to set it to neutral by the beginning. So we're going to say hue neutral here. Whoops, neutral, there we go. And we also want to come in here and we're going to set the background color. So background color is going to be HSL. We're going to get the variable for our hue. And we want to set here the saturation to be 100%, but we want the lightness to be 50% because we want this to be brighter than our background. And if you save, we see we get a much brighter blue color on our buttons. Also, we need to come in here and change our border. So let's do that now. We're going to come to our border. And we're going to make this a 1 pixel solid. Again, HSL because we want it to match that same hue. So we're going to use var of our hue again. we want to come in here with a saturation of 100% and a lightness of 30% because we want this to be a little bit darker than our actual color, and as you can see we get a slightly darker blue border around all of our buttons. Now we can come in, give it a little bit of a rounded corner, so we'll say border radius is just going to be 5 pixels. We want to give it a little bit of padding so it's not quite crunched up against the edge, so we'll say 5 pixels and 10 pixels, just like that, and you can see our buttons have gotten a little bit bigger because of that. And then lastly, we want to change the text color to white, and we want to remove the outline from our button, so we'll say outline none, and there you go. As you can see, our buttons are looking almost exactly the same as our buttons over here, but we don't have a hover effect yet, so let's add that in. That's just going to be really simple. We can just say button, hover, and all we want to do is change the border color to be black. Now when we hover, you can see our border has changed to black. Now let's do that same hue trick that we did, so we can have a button with a class of correct, just like this, and we're also going to do the same thing, but a button with the class of wrong. Whoops, wrong, there we go. And inside of our correct button here, all we need to do is we just need to set that hue, and we want to make sure we set it to the variable, which is the hue for correct. Let's copy that down, copy that here, do the exact same thing, but we want the wrong hue for our wrong button, and let's test that out by adding these classes. So we're just going to make this one a class of correct, and we're going to make this one a class of wrong. And if you save that, as you can see, it's looking pretty good, but this white text on the green is kind of hard to see. So inside of here, let's change our color to be black, and if we save that, you now see it's much easier to see the text inside of the green button, and that's looking perfect. Let's remove these classes so that we no longer have these incorrectly styled by default. And there we go, everything's back to blue. And the last thing we need to do is style our start and our next button. And again, this is going to be pretty simple. Let's just select them. We can select our start button and our next button. We want them both to be very similar. And we can change the font size. We want it to be quite a bit bigger. We use 1.5 REM. And we also want these to be bold. So we use a font weight of bold, as well as padding to make them even bigger. So we use 10 pixels and 20 pixels. And if we say that, you see our buttons are quite a bit bigger, and it's okay that they're on different lines. These are never both going to be showing at the same time, so that's okay. Also, we want these buttons to be centered in our page. So let's do that. We have our controls, which is wrapping our buttons, and we can just come in here and change this to be a display of flex, and we just want to justify the content in the center, and we want to align the items also in the center. Now if you save that, you see that they're much more centered, and we can use the hide class lastly. So we can say hide, which is just going to have here a display of none. Now if you save that, you see we're left with just our start button, and it's centered perfectly in our screen. Now that we have all of our styles out of the way, we need to work on our JavaScript so that when we click on our start button, it actually does something. Let's jump into our script.js here, and let's actually just think about the workflow of our quiz application. Essentially, we have 3 different things we need to do. We need to be able to start the game, so let's create a function for that, which is going to be start game, and this is essentially what we want to do when we click the start button. We're also going to need another function here, which is going to be for setting our next question. So we can just say set next question, and this is going to be what happened when we click on the next button inside of our application. And then lastly, when we select an answer, we need to do something. So let's create here a function which is just going to be called select answer. Now let's not actually implement any of these yet, because we just need to think about the workflow of it first. Now what we can do is, since we know how to implement start game, we need that to be on our start button. Let's select our start button. So we can go start button here is going to be equal to document.getElementById, getElementById, and this is going to be the ID of start button, just like that. And we can just come down here and we can just say we want our start button dot add event listener, and whenever we click on it, we want to execute the code that's inside of start game. So we can just say start game here, and for example, we can just say console.log started, and let's actually test if that works. Let's go over here, let's inspect our page, jump over to the console and click the start button, and you can see it prints out the text started, so we know that our start game function is being called on our start button when we click on it. Now inside of the start button is going to be fairly simple. Essentially all we need to do is we need to take our start button and we want to hide it. So let's go class list.add. We just want to add that hide class so that it's no longer being shown up, and now when we click on it, you can see it disappears, which is perfect. But we also want to be able to show our questions. So let's select our question container. We can come down here, we can just say const question container element is going to be equal to document.getElementById, and we just want this to be for our question container. Whoops, make sure you spell that properly. There we go, and we can come down here. What we want to do with this, take the same class list, but we want to remove the hide class. Now if we click start, you can see our question container is showing up. Let's close out of that. Now that we have all of this working with our hiding and our showing, let's work on making it actually implement and show our question. So the very first thing our start game should do is just set the next question. So we can just call set next question, and it should set the first question for us. but we need a list of questions. So let's create that list. We're just going to create a const variable here. We're going to call it questions, just like this. And we can initialize this to an array. And the first object in this array is going to be our first question. So our question is going to have some elements. The first one is going to be the actual question itself, which is just going to be the text of the question. Let's just say, what is 2 plus 2? Just like this. And then we're going to have an array, which is going to have our answers. So let's copy this over here, and we can just say that our answers are going to have a object, which is going to have a text keyword. So for example, 4, which is going to be the correct answer. So we're going to just set correct to true for that. Then we're also going to give it another option, which is going to be the text of 22. We obviously know that this is incorrect. So we're going to set correct equal to false. Now if we save that, we actually have a question here, and we need to actually use that question inside of our set next question. But we don't always want our questions to show up in the exact same order. If we have 100 questions, we don't want the first one to always be first and the second one to always be second. We want to shuffle them so that they're always completely random. So let's create 2 new variables. Up here, we're going to have a const variable, which is going to be our shuffled questions. And we're also going to have our current question index. So we're going to say current question index. So we know which question inside of the shuffled questions array we're on. And we can just do this const like this. This is going to default both of these values to undefined, which is perfect for our needs. Now here in our start game function is where we want to set our shuffled questions equal to that shuffled array. So we can take our current questions array that we have, and all we need to do is sort it. This is going to take a function, and if it's a negative number, it's going to sort it a certain way, and if it's a positive number, it's going to sort it another way. So essentially, you can sort things by negative number being one way and positive being the other way. And if you just want a random number that's either going to be below 0 or above 0, you can use math.random, which is going to give us a number between 1 and 0. And if we subtract 0.5 from it, we're going to get a number that's either less than 0 or above 0 50% of the time, which gives us a completely random array. This essentially shuffles all of our different questions for us. We also want to set the current question index to 0 because we're starting on the very first question in our shuffled questions array. Now here, inside of our set question, what we want to do is we actually want to get that question, and we want to show it. So we're going to create a function called showQuestion, and it's going to take our current question, which is our shuffled questions, at the current question index, just like this. And let's create that function right down here, function showQuestion, and this is just going to take a question. Question. And as we remember, this question object is just going to be this down here. So it's going to be having a text here, which is question, as well as our answers in an array just like this. So we actually need to grab a few more objects up here. First, we need to grab our question element. So we can just say question element is going to be equal to document.getElementById, getElementById, which is just going to say question. And we're also going to want to do the same thing for our answer grid. So we're just going to say here that our answer buttons element is going to be equal to document.getElementById of answer buttons. Buttons. There we go. And now we can take our question element and we can say that we want the inner text to be equal to our question dot question. And now let's actually just see if this actually works. So if we click start, you can see that nothing's happening. So let's check to see if we have an error. And if we go over into our console, we can see that we're getting an error that says missing initializer in const declaration. If we scroll up here, we see that we accidentally defined these as const variables. Let's define them as let so that they can be redefined later. Now if we save that and click start, you see that it's properly changing our question to the actual question that we put down here. And if we change this, for example, put the question mark at the end, click start, you can see that that's also being populated here. Next thing we need to work on is populating our different answers. In order to do that, we just need to loop through our question's answers. So we can just come in here and say question.answers.forEach, and we're going to get a single answer for each one of these loops inside this function here. And we want to create a button for each one of them. So let's create a button using document.createElement. Create element. There we go. We're going to pass it in the type of element we want, which is button. And we want to set the inner text of this to be equal to our answer.text. And we also in here want to set our class. So we're going to say our button.classList.add. We want to make sure we add the button class to it. And then we all want to check here if our answer is correct. So if our answer is correct, what we want to do is we want to take our button.dataset. And this is going to add a data attribute onto our button element. And we want to add an attribute of correct and just set it equal to answer.correct. And the reason that we're doing this only if we have the correct answer and not for every answer is because if it's false for the answer, we don't want to actually set false in the data attribute because it'll make it difficult for us to tell which ones are correct or not, since it's just going to be a string and not an actual Boolean. So we're only setting this if the button is correct. This will make it easier later when we're checking if this answer is correct. Now what we want to do is we want to set an event listener. So let's add an event listener to this button for whenever we click on it. And we just want to set that to be the select answer that we have down here. So this is going to actually take our event in as a parameter. Now the last thing we need to do is add this to our answer button's element. So we can just say append child, and we want to append this button we just created. Now let's check how this works. We click start, and you can see that it's appending these two answers down here, which is great, but it's having our old answers on here as well, and we don't want these answers. We want to actually clear out these answers every single time that we set our next question. So let's create another function. This is just going to be called reset state, and this is just going to reset everything related to our form, our questions, our body, all back to its default state every time we set a new question. So let's create that function down here. Function reset state. And inside of here, the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to hide our next button. So we can just say our next button dot class list dot add, and we want to make sure this is hidden. And that's because after we click on an answer, we're going to show the next button, and then when we show the next question, we want to make sure we hide that next button again. Next, we're going to want to loop through all of the children for our answer button elements. So we're going to say that while the answer button elements dot first child, essentially if there is a child inside of the answer button elements, we want to remove it. So we can just say answer button element here dot remove child, and we just want to remove the first child for it. So we can just say dot first child. Whoops, just like that. Now if we click start, you can see that we're obviously getting an error since something's not working. Let's check out what that error is. If we go in the console, we can see that next button is not defined. And that's because we haven't actually selected that. So let's just copy down our start button here and use it to select our next button. And down here again, we're going to select our next button. And now if we exit out of this, click start, you can see it's properly deleting all of those answers that came before and setting our new answers and our question. Let's remove this console here since we no longer need it. Now we can finally move on to actually doing what we need to do when we select our answer, because right now clicking on it doesn't actually do anything. It just calls the select answer function. And the first thing we want to do in here is we want to get which button we selected. So let's just get a variable called selected button, and that's just going to be e.target, because this is whatever we clicked on. And now we want to check if it's correct. So we can just get a variable called correct here, which is going to be equal to our selected button. And we want to check the data set dot correct. Now from here, we need to do a few things. The first thing we need to do is we want to set the status class of our body. So we're going to create a function that's going to do that. It's going to take our document.body, and it's going to take whether or not it actually should be set to correct or wrong. We also need to loop through all of our different other buttons and actually select and set the class for them. So let's do that now. We can say array.from, and we want to create an array from our answer button elements.children. And the reason we need to make sure we convert this to an array is because this right here, answer button.children, this is returning a live collection, which is not technically an array, and it updates on its own. So we need to convert this to an array so that we can use it with our for each loop. So we can say for each here, and this is going to be all of our different buttons. So for each button, we want to make sure that this is a function here, and inside of here, we want to just set the status for them. So we're going to use that same set status class. This is going to take our button, and it's going to check the button.dataset.correct, because we want to set the status based on whether or not that answer was a correct answer. So now let's create that function. Just down here, it's going to be set status class, and inside of here, we're just going to take an element, and we're also going to take whether or not it's correct. And inside of here, the first thing we want to do is we want to clear any status that it already has. So we're going to say clear status class, which is going to be a function we're going to create, and that's going to take the element that we're going to clear this on. Then we're going to check if this is correct. So if it is correct, we want to add the correct class. So we're just going to say element.classlist.add, and we want to add the class of correct. Now we can do almost the exact same thing for our else statement, but instead of adding correct, we want to add the wrong class. And instead of our function to clear the status class, which is going to take that element, all we need to do in here is essentially the exact same thing, but we want to remove these classes instead of add them. And let's make sure we do this for wrong as well. And now, if we click on start here, and we click on one of our answers, for example 4, you can see our background shows up as the green, and our button shows up as green, and our wrong button shows up as the wrong color. And if we click on the wrong one, you can see it changes our background to red. One of the last things we have left to do is actually show our next button. So in order to do that, we can just come down here, we can say our next button, .ClassList.remove, and we just want to remove the hidden class from it. Now when we click start, and we click on one of these, you see our next button is showing up. So now let's actually make our next button work. This is going to be fairly simple. We just come up here, we can just say next button add event listener, add event listener. We want to add a click event listener. And inside of here, what we want to do is the first thing we need to do is we need to take our current question index and we need to add 1 to it because it's going to be incrementing to the very next question that we have. And then we just need to call set next question, just like this. But we will run into a problem. As you can see, when we click this and we click next, we're going to get an error. Everything's going to disappear. Things are not working properly. And that's because we ran out of questions. We only have 1 question right now. So we ran out of questions for these answers. So what we need to do is actually check down here if we have any more questions to go through. So we're going to check our shuffled questions.length, and we want to see if that length is greater than our current question index plus 1. This means that we have more questions than we are currently on. We're essentially not on the last question. So if that's the case, we want to actually show our next button. But if for some reason we're not on the very last, or if we are on the very last question, so in this else statement, we want to take our start button because essentially we want to allow the user to restart. So we're going to change the text to this to be equal to restart. And then we also want to show this button. So we'll say start button dot class list dot remove hide. Now, when we answer this, you'll see we get the restart button and it's going to restart our game back from the very beginning. So let's add some more questions here. I'm just going to copy these over. There we go. All of our different questions are now inputted. And if we click start, we see we get our original question that we had before. Let's answer this correctly. Click next, and you'll notice we already have a bug. Our background color is not being cleared between sets. So inside of our reset function here, we want to make sure that we clear our status class for our document.body. Now when we click start and we click on the correct answer here, which is obviously yes, you'll see it'll show up green. And when we click next, it's going to go back to that blue color, which is perfect. And if we go through the rest of these, 4 plus 4, and we can now finally figure out who is the best YouTuber. I'm slightly biased, so I'm going to choose Web Dev Simplified. But as you can see, all these answers are correct because these are all great YouTubers. And next, we can go through here, select this, and we get the restart option, and it'll restart us with a random question. And with that, we finally have our entire quiz application built. If you want to see more videos of me simplifying the web for you, make sure to check them out over here, and also subscribe to the channel for more videos like this. Thank you very much for watching, and have a good day.